Ethicators by Willard Marsh. The missionaries came out of the planetary system of a star they didn't call Antares. They called it, naturally enough, the sun, just as home was Earth, Terra, or simply the world. And naturally enough, being the ascendant animal on Earth, they called themselves human beings. They were looking for extraterrestrial souls to save. They had no real hope of finding humans like themselves in this wondrously diversified universe. But it wasn't against all probability that, in their rummaging, there might not be a humanoid species to whom they could reach down a helping paw, some emergent cousin with at least a rudimentary symmetry from snout to tail, and hence a rudimentary soul. The ship they chose was a compact scout, vaguely resembling the outside of an orange crate, except that they had no concept of an orange crate, and, being a tesseract, it had no particular outside. It was simply an expanding cube, and as such, quite roomy, whose interior was always paralleling its exterior, or attempting to, in accordance with all the well-known, basic, and irrefutable laws on the subject. A number of its sides occupied the same place at the same time, giving a hypothetical spectator the illusion of looking down merging sets of railway tracks. This, in fact, was its precise method of locomotion. The inner cube was always having to catch up, caboose fashion, with the outer one in time, or space, depending on one's perspective. And whenever it had done so, it would have arrived with itself, at approximately wherever in the space-time continuum it had pointed. When they felt the jar of the settling geodesics, the crew crowded at the forward visiplate to see where they were. It was the outskirts of a G-type star system. Silently, they watched the innermost planet float past, scorched and craggy, its sunward side seeming about to relapse to a molten state. The bosun colonel turned to the conductor. "A bit of a disappointment, I'm afraid, sir. Surely, with all that heat—" "Steady, lad. The last wicket's not been bowled." The conductor's whiskers quivered in amusement at his next-in-command's impetuosity. "You'll notice that we're dropping downward. If the temperature accordingly continues dropping—" He couldn't shrug. He was physiologically capable of it, but it was apparent that he felt they'd soon reach a planet whose climate could support intelligent life. If the bosun colonel had any ideas that such directions as up and down were meaningless in space, he kept them to himself. As the second planet from its sun hove into view, he switched on the magnoscan eagerly. "I say, this is more like it. Clouds and all that sort of thing. Should we have a go at it, sir?" The conductor yawned. "Too bloody cloudy for my taste. Too equivocal. Let's push on," he said languidly. "I have a hunch the third planet might be just our dish of tea." Quelling his disappointment, the bosun colonel waited for the third planet to swim into being, and when it did, blooming like an orchid in all its greens and moistness, he could scarcely contain his excitement. "Why, it looks just like Earth," he marveled. "Gad, sir, what a master-stroke of navigation! How did you realize this would be it?" "Oh, I don't know," the conductor said modestly. "Things usually have a habit of occurring in threes. I'm quite a student of numerology, you know." Then he remembered the mission and drew himself erect on all his legs. "You may prepare for landing, mister," he ordered crisply. The bosun colonel shifted over to Manuel and busied himself at the helm, luffing the square craft down the troghs of air, gliding over the vast tropical oceans. He put down at a large land mass above a shallow, warm sea, 25 degrees below the northern pole. Too numbered for comment, the crew stared out at the alien vista. They heard of retarded life forms from other missionary expeditions, of planets where the inhabitants, in extreme emergency, had been known to commit murder. But surely this was the worst, the most vicious imaginable in the galaxy. Here, with life freshly up from the sea, freshly launched on the long climb to maturity and self-realization, was nothing but horror. With so lush a vegetation, so easily capable of supporting them side by side in abundance, the monsters were actually feeding on each other. Great lumbering beasts they were, with their bristling hides and huge tails, charging between the giant tree ferns, gouging living chunks from one another, while razor-toothed birds with scaly wings flapped overhead, screaming for their remnants. As the sounds of carnage came through the audio ports, the youngest oarsman keeled over in a faint. Even the conductor was visibly shaken. The bosun colonel turned to him with a sick expression. "Surely it's a lost cause, skipper. Life like this will never have a soul worth saving." Not in its present stage, the old man was forced to agree. Still, one never knows the devious paths that evolution takes. He considered the scene for a thoughtful, shuddering interval. Perhaps, in several thousand millenniums, the bosun colonel tried to visualize this possibility of ethical life ever materializing through these swamp mists, but the logic against it was too insurmountable for the imagination. Even so, he conceded, granting the impossible, whatever shape it took, the only worthwhile species would still be, he couldn't bring himself to say it, meat-eaters, the conductor supplied grimly. On hearing this, the oarsman who had just revived promptly fainted again. It's too deep in the genes, the conductor continued, too far advanced for us to tamper with. All we can do is hope to modify their moral outlook, so that by the time they achieve star travel, they'll at least have a basic sense of fair play. Sighing, bowed by responsibilities inconsummate with his chronological youth, he gave the order wearily. It was snapped down the chain of command to the senior yardbird. All paws stand by to lower the ethics ray. Step lively, lads. Bugger off now. There was a din of activity as the outer locks were opened and the bulky mechanism was shipped over the side. It squatted on a cleared rise of ground in all its complex, softly tickling majesty, waiting for the first human to pad within range of its shedding grace and uplift. The work party scrambled back to the ship, anxious to be off this sinister terrain. Once more, the crew gathered at the visiplate as the planet fell away beneath them, the ethics ray winking in the day's last light like a cornerstone, or perhaps a tambourine. Night closed down on the raw, chaotic world. Huge beasts closed in on the strange star-fallen souvenir. They snuffled over it, then enraged at discovering it was nothing they could fill their clamoring, mindless stomachs with, attempted to wreck it. They were unsuccessful, for the machine had been given an extra heavy coat of shellac and things to withstand such monkey shines, and the machine, in its own finely calibrated way, ignored its harassers, for they had no resemblance to the life it had been tuned to influence. Days lengthened into decades, eons. The seas came shouldering in to stand towers tall above the ethics ray, lost in the far ooze below. Then even the seas receded, and the mountains buckled upward in their place, their arrogant stone faces staring changelessly across the epochs, until they were too whittled down by erosion. The ice caps crept down, crackling and grinding the valleys. The ground stretched and tossed like a restless sleeper, settled, and the ethics ray was brought to light once more. As it always had, it continued beaming in its particular signal, on a cosmic ray carrier modulated by a pulse a particular number of angstroms below infrared. The beasts that blundered within its field were entirely different now, but they still weren't the right ones. Among them were some shambling pale bipeds, dressed in skins of other beasts, who clutched over its gleaming exterior and tried to chip it away for spearheads. In this, of course, they were unsuccessful. And then one day the first human wandered by, paused square in the path of the beam. His physiology was only approximate. His IQ was regrettably low, but he was pre-moral life, such as it was on this planet. The ethics ray made the necessary frequency adjustments, tripped on full force. The primitive froze under the bombardment, its germplasm shifting in the most minute and subtle dimensions. Then, its mission fulfilled, the ethics ray collapsed into heavy molecules and sank into the ground. The first convert raced away in fright, having no idea what had happened. Neither did his billion sons and daughters. Back on the home base, the conductor reported in at the Ethication of Primitive Planet's office. It was a magnificently imposing building, as befitting the moral seat of the universe. And the overseer was an equally imposing human with ears grayed by service. His congratulations were unreversed. "A splendid mission, lad," he said, "and I don't mind suggesting, strictly entre nous, that it could jolly well result in a fleet conductorship for you." The conductor was overwhelmed. "Now, just let me jot down the essentials while they're still fresh in my mind," he continued, pawing through a desk drawer. "Botheration! I seem to have traded the last of my styluses. Do you happen to have one on you?" With pleasure, the conductor handed over his monogrammed gold stylus, receiving in exchange a toy silence maker. "My youngster traded it to me this morning," the overseer chuckled. He wrote rapidly for several moments, then gave the stylus back. The conductor found a weathered paper weight in his rear pocket, which he traded him for it. It looked like it might have come from this very desk at one time. Then, with a smart salute, he about-faced. On the way out, a pair of secretaries paused in their trading of a pelt brush for a tail curler to watch him admiringly. As well they might. Fleet conductor. The future fleet conductor of a solar system he would never think of calling Antares paused at the door. In its polished panel, he regarded himself with due appreciation. He had sown the seeds of civilization on a far-flung planet where, countless light years from now, they would flower to maturity. Not among the strongest or cleverest species, to be sure, but among those most worthy of applying first principles, the moral law of give and take. Among those remote cousins of the conductor himself, who under no circumstances would ever think of himself as resembling a rather oversized trader rat. End of The Ethicators by Willard Marsh.